Carl Panzram. Carl Panzram. What makes him unusual and particularly frightening, Carl Panzram, is that more than the crimes themselves, his story is really one about rage against life itself. Carl Panzram. Hello again, everyone, and welcome to Well-Hung History, where we tell true tales of the condemned and the executed. I'm your host, Terry Allen, and thanks for joining us. This episode will focus on someone who is not always easy to talk about, nor even hear about. So, though on this show we're not in the business of offering listener warnings, today's subject is not for the squeamish, so please be advised. Our subject today is none other than Carl Panzram. And before we get further into who this was and what he did, quick note on his surname. Sometimes pronounced Panzram, sometimes pronounced Panzram. It's not really important. I'm just going to refer to him as Carl Panzram. He is notorious for all sorts of incalculable crimes that he committed during his lifetime. What makes him unusual and particularly frightening is that more than the crimes themselves, his story is really one about rage against life itself. Yes, we will be discussing the details of his tortured existence and the immeasurable pain that he inflicted on so many others, but we'll also discuss his motivations and his nihilism, most of which we know about not from conjecture, not from newspaper articles of the time or corroborated contemporary sources, but actually from his own written words, which basically may have well been written in blood. And a lot of what we know about Panzram came from a diary that he wrote at Leavenworth prison and other prisons. And we'll talk more about that diary itself as we get towards the end of the episode. And when we think about his diary, and we need to think that these were not confessions. This also makes him unusual. They were rather cold, hard accounts, often boasts of the wrath he waged against the entire world, that he blamed for turning him into the fiend and the demon that he was. Let's cover some basics of Panzram's early beginnings, and none of these should be a surprise really to anyone. He was born poor on a farm in East Grand Forks, Minnesota, and he was born in 1890. He was born to a family of immigrants from Prussia, so that would be Germany today, perhaps Poland, the German-Polish border. And they were very poor, they were rural, barely literate people, and by all accounts were very, very severe. He had several brothers, and he had a sister as well. He was beaten regularly, not that unusual perhaps at the time, or even today, unfortunately, but this was a very austere existence. So picture the plains of Minnesota on a farm, very, very poor family. And his family, his parents, were very much opposed to any idea of schooling. And as he started to grow up, as still a young child, truancy laws were passed and increasingly enforced. So he was forced to attend school, which his parents objected to. I never had much schooling, but he did have some schooling, and he was not illiterate. Not the greatest scholar, but he was he was taught to learn to read or write. However, his parents inflicted this retribution on their own children because they really wanted them to work on the farm all day. And so as the children were forced to attend school, when they would come home, the children were sent to work on the farm and in the barn and so on at nightfall. This is not exactly an easy life as a young child. In Panzram's recollections, he claims that he was just beaten on a regular basis, something that will exist in all forms of his life throughout his life. So he was abused, obviously. He claims that he was only allowed 2 or 3 hours of sleep each night. And I think these situations were so extreme and so unpleasant that all but one of his siblings ran away, including Carl himself, which we're about to get into. So not a happy place. His father, in fact, very early on in his life, it's said at about 7 years old, his father abandons the family. So things become even more extreme as he grows into early adolescent years. So the mother is left to take care of the farm. Does not sound like a real happy situation. Now, before we get to his catalog, which is a never-ending catalog, and we're not going to be able to cover all of it, but when we get to his catalog of crimes, which is seemingly nonstop through the 40 years of his life, he claims to have committed his first crimes at 5 years old, that he started stealing things from the local village store and burglarizing neighbors' houses. Now, whether this is true or not, we don't know for sure. 5 years old, even for a total miscreant, that seems pretty extreme. But he was actually probably stealing things from his own family that didn't have much to steal. Now, as he grows up, he was noted for being very physically strong. And this was probably due to genetics. He was about 6 feet tall, which would have been tall for a man in that era, in the late 19th century. But also because he was just required to do so much physical labor. In 1899, the age of 8, he was first arrested, and the charge was drunk and disorderly conduct. Now, 8 years old, really? I don't think that's totally unheard of, but it's still a shocking age to be arrested for that sort of thing. This is not stealing a candy bar. This may have just been a term used at the time in that area to describe antisocial behavior by a young person, but that was the charge. He was arrested for the same thing a few years later, and he would have been arrested for this many times in his life. But we have to picture an 8, 9, 10-year-old kid being arrested for being drunk in public. So he regularly commits burglaries and thieveries in his early teens, and this just continues habitually. In 1903, his mother is just fed up with him. He's out of control, and he's sent to the Minnesota State Training School in Red Wing, which was a reform school. Now, he was not happy about this. I don't think any 12-year-old kid would be. And it's here where the brutality starts. So we're going from drunk and disorderly, we're going from thievery at abnormally young age to regular beatings and just extremely harsh treatment at this reform school. He also claims, and this is part of the story, and it's not meant to be prurient for this podcast, but this is where he first discusses that he was raped and gang raped by other boys at this school and also by the staff of the school. And this is a concurrent theme throughout the rest of his life and his criminal career. So he's kept in terrible conditions, brutal conditions, according to him. And there's something in this place that everyone that was involved, I'm assuming both the staff and the students, especially the prisoners, the juvies basically, called the paint room. And the paint room was not what we would think of. This is not the type of stuff where you paint a house with. The paint room was called that by the juvenile offenders because this is a room where he describes as a kind of a makeshift torture chamber. So it derived its name from the fact that there were bloodstains on the walls. These young offenders would be brutally beaten. So this represented the colors of bruises and blood. So he was beaten regularly in the paint room. He's so angered by this, as I think anyone would. He's so outraged by this. He does what he does for the rest of his life. He decides he's going to burn the place down. And he does. And he actually burns down part of this institution. Now, arson was one of his incalculable crimes. He does this regularly. This is the first known incident of that. Rather than responding by yelling at the teachers or the ward, the guards or whatever, he responds by committing arson. He was also known for developing a serious problem with alcohol. And again, we're still talking about a adolescent or even pre-adolescent at this time. In one of, if not only, the brief moments of avoiding his violent tendencies, he somehow makes some sort of a relationship with a visiting Lutheran minister who was there to sort of set the boys straight and try to turn them to God. and he actually thinks about joining the seminary. But this doesn't last long. In fact, it's estimated maybe a matter of weeks, a month or so. And what does he do? He shoots and attempts to kill this minister. We don't know many of the details, but that's what he claims he did. At this point, he also adds to his list of just rage. He's raging against religion, all religion. And he expressed this throughout his life. He actually claimed that it was at that point that he would always seek vengeance and revenge against anybody that espoused religion. So at this point, after this incident, he runs away and he basically rides the rails. And we all have a picture, if you've ever read a Jack London book or anything sort of from this era, we have this sort of romanticized idea maybe of hobo life. But he lived this life. And so picture a 14-year-old kid. He's essentially riding along with vagabonds, homeless men for the most part. And he starts to begin a lifelong history of incarceration. So this would have been county jails. He was riding the rails in the Midwest initially. The scope of his travels at such a young age is quite stunning, and we'll get into some of those. It's also here where he mentions again this constant theme that he was gang raped by a group of hobos, actually in a railway car. So he's traveling around through the Plain States, and he makes his way to the West Coast. So he's traveling a lot of the time in the Northwest. He's in Oregon, he's in Washington. He goes down to California, and then he starts committing crimes everywhere he goes. He's just a complete hellion. Let's talk about his first incarcerations, which were virtually nonstop, the crime spree that never seems to end, and the numerous, shocking number of prison breaks. It's really impossible to quantify the number of times that Panzram was arrested and imprisoned from his first incarceration until his ultimate execution. His longer prison stints are mostly public record, but there are doubtless other brief stints in various county jails that we can't really know about. What I guess is important to understand here is that despite all of his jailbreaks and voluminous travels, he rarely spent any meaningful time out of some sort of confinement. In the summer of 1906, Panzram shows up in Butte, Montana, and he's arrested there for burglary, and he's sentenced to a year in jail at the state reform school there. So now he's sort of getting into his late teens, and surprise, surprise, he assaults a prison guard there and is sent to solitary confinement for a few months. So after being released from this latest incarceration, he teams up with another prisoner named James Benson, and they break out and they head to Helena, Montana, where they immediately start terrorizing that town and surrounding settlements. And they commit numerous burglaries. And also, they burn down 2 of the churches in the area. So again, he's expressing his rage, not only at religion, but at everything in his way. He separates from this guy Benson, and he heads out on his own for a while in North Dakota. And then soon after that, he returns to Helena, and on a drunken bet, it's said, he enlists in the U.S. Army. So almost immediately upon enlistment in the military, he runs afoul of superiors, and he was convicted of larceny for stealing $80 worth of supplies from the commissary at the base. This is not county jail now. He's actually convicted of a federal crime, and so he's sent to the disciplinary barracks at Fort Leavenworth in Kansas. And eventually we're going to do a full podcast on Fort Leavenworth, which for most of its existence served as a federal prison for those that had committed crimes within the military. So he's sentenced to Leavenworth in 1908, and he's stuck there for 2 years. But this would not be his last stint at Leavenworth, as we will learn later. Again, hearkening back to his diary, he expresses his growing rage as if you can't get more outrageous. Trust me, keep listening, it gets more outrageous. He just becomes totally incorrigible while he was at Leavenworth. And this is where he claims he considered himself a petty criminal and basically just a scumbag. And this is where he said he was really determined to wage war on everything and everyone. And he blames this imprisonment for turning him this way and more spiteful and more dangerous. So he's discharged from the army and he's released. And he resumes his crime sprees. And now we find him in jails in, listen to this list. He was a notorious criminal, but he seems like a terrible criminal because he is arrested in Oregon, Idaho, California, Montana again, Kansas, Texas. And then eventually he ends up somehow on the East Coast. He's arrested in Connecticut, twice in New York, and then Washington, D.C. Now, this would have been over years, but he's constantly not only committing crimes, he seems to be an expert at actually getting arrested. He starts using all sorts of aliases because as he becomes notorious to various officials in prisons, even though, it's not as if there was a database then like there would be today. So it was easier to use an alias. And so he was able to sort of adopt these names, some of which were outrageous. One that was used commonly was John O'Leary. Okay. But he also, at some point, claims to be, his name is Jefferson Davis, and then he's from Alabama. So it's kind of hard to believe a German-American guy from Minnesota was convincing anybody that he was the name of the former Confederate president and that he was from Alabama. But anyway, that's what is said. During this period, he again claims that he is raping men in prison, and then when he gets released, he's raping hobos. He's also being raped in return. And we're going to talk about this in a little more detail. I'm not interested in the salacious part of it, but it's impossible really to talk about Panzram without talking about his sexual behavior. I am not a psychologist. I don't pretend to be a psychologist or a sexologist or anything of the sort. But we have to talk about this because this is important in his testaments. I'm not going to call them confessions because they were never confessions. We have to think about how homosexuality at this time would have been treated. And I'm sure we're going to get calls on this and messages, but I'm not trying to be an expert here. I think it's serious and it's an important topic. People that know more about this topic can think what they want, and feel free to reach out to us if you think we're misreading this. It's not my job to speculate on Panzram's sexuality, but what is important and what's crucial to his story is that he made no apologies, and he sometimes boasted that he claimed to have sodomized over 1,000 boys and men in his lifetime. So this is important because most people at this period would not, in the early 20th century, would not have admitted to homosexuality. This does not really mean necessarily that he was homosexual. What is important and what we should think about is that he treated life itself as nothing but brutality. So everything that we know about him suggests that he never expressed any sort of romantic affection for anyone of any sex. For him, this just meant control or being controlled. And he certainly would have learned a lot of this from a very young age in prison and also on the road, as we've discussed. He himself refers to sexual encounters with women, but they're always negative. There's nothing that seems of any sort of interest, any sort of romantic interest for either men or women. Everything is simply an act of violence. He claims that he raped a woman in Denver during this period and that she gave him gonorrhea. This just actually intensified his hatred of women. He hated his mother. He blamed this woman who gave him this venereal disease. Later on, we'll find out that he also raped women and children in another continent. So again, there's not one notation of any sort of affection towards anyone. So sex to him was probably like burglarizing, like robbing someone and then killing someone. In June 1915, Panzram is sentenced to 7 years in the Oregon State Prison in Salem. And this becomes yet another vital part of this story. The Oregon State Penitentiary at the time was considered one of the most brutal places, really, to have been confined. So he's sent there and he's got 7 years. Well, he vows that he will never serve these 7 years. What happens in the interim is important to the story. So here we go again, back to more brutality, back to very, very vicious sorts of confinement. The warden of this prison was a man named Harry Minto, who was known as a strict disciplinarian. And in my opinion, from accounts I've read, I think we can call this guy a sadist. He was really a nasty guy. And he was not somebody interested in prison reform or anything of the sort. So when Panzram is sentenced to this prison, he openly expresses a disdain for the warden, Mr. Minto, and he proclaims that he will kill this person. Soon after his incarceration there, Panzram and another prisoner named Otto Hooker kind of plot this, again, another prison escape. This time it's not Panzram, it's Hooker that escapes. So when Hooker actually does escape, he kind of hides out for a little while, and he's cornered in Albany, Oregon, by the authorities there, and also by the warden, Minto himself. A shootout ensues, and Hooker kills Minto. Following the murder of the warden, Minto, his brother assumes the same role, and so now he's in charge. After Hooker is arrested and eventually executed for this crime, Panzram is really subjected to horrible treatment, which he probably deserved, depending on how we want to think about this situation. It would be unlikely to think that he would have been treated in sort of a nice manner. So he's still rambling and raving, and here we are. Now we're going to 1917. After this confinement, he escapes from Salem in 1917, and he's captured, and then he's returned again a year later. I don't know why this guy keeps escaping from prison. I don't know how he's allowed to escape from prison, but he does, and he escapes in 1917, and he's returned. Not only is he returned to the Oregon State Prison, he absconds once again. This is also very pivotal to the story because he escapes again from Oregon. He never would return again to the Western United States. So once he escapes the Oregon Penitentiary for the second and final time, he does the opposite of what he's done for most of his life. He goes east. Go east, young man. And he ends up in New York. And he signs up on a merchant marine ship called the James S. Whitney. And he sails to London, Edinburgh, Paris, Hamburg, etc. And then he makes his way to Chile, and he worked briefly there in a copper mine. This guy can't stop traveling. I mean, it's unbelievable. He's escaping, he's running, he's committing mayhem, but he is the consummate traveler. So now he's in Chile, and while he was there, the inevitable ensues. He fights with his boss there, he gets in trouble, and then he continues back to the United States. In 1920, he's now about 30 years old, Panzram turns up in New England, back in the United States, and he does what he does. He commits burglaries in Newport, Rhode Island, and then he burglarizes the home of the former presidents, William Howard Taft, in New Haven, Connecticut. And we didn't talk about this earlier, but Taft had actually, there's a reason for this, and that's why we're mentioning it. Taft himself had signed the prison warrants to send Panzram to Leavenworth years before. When he burglarizes Taft's home, he steals jewelry and he steals Taft's revolver. He's stealing personal belongings of a former president. And it appears that what he's stolen from Taft actually results in a lot of money. He steals his personal belongings. He steals the former president's gun. And he uses the proceeds of this burglary to buy a sailboat. And he sails around New York City. So here he goes again. He lures sailors in and near New York City bars and frequently rapes them, and claims at this point to have killed 10 men with Taft's own handgun during this period. Soon after this, he's arrested for burglary in Connecticut, and he served more time in jail there. He, at this point, boarded a ship to Angola. Now he's on his way to Africa. He seems to have established himself as some sort of a seaman. He goes to Angola and he works on an oil rig there. And again, he burns it down after feuding with his boss. It's worth noting here, and it was alluded to earlier, and this is very disturbing. I mean, it's all disturbing, but this is particularly stunning. When he's in Angola in West Africa, there's an episode here which is particularly disturbing. He somehow meets a family in a village, wherever he's living there, and he essentially he arranges to buy 2 young girls of a family in this place. And his intention, of course, is to rape and mutilate them. From his own account, his idea was that these 2 very young girls were supposed to be virgins, and that was part of this arrangement. And he rapes them, and he essentially returns the goods. This is what is so depressing. He returns these girls. Not only does he rape them, he kills them, or at least he kills one of them. And he complains to the parents of these young girls that he was unhappy with his purchase because they were not virgins as was promised. Okay, that's why we're not going to go into great detail about this, because that's not what this show is really meant to be. But we're trying to establish how horrible this person was. And it's at this point also in Angola that he confesses to raping and killing, this time, a boy. And his exact quotes are this: "His brains were coming out his ears, and when I left him, he will never be any deader." Also, while he's in Africa, he claims to have rented a boat with 6 rowers. So in some sort of a river or canal or something, he claims to have shot them all and fed them to the crocodiles. Panzram leaves Africa and he comes back to the United States after committing these unspeakable crimes in Africa. He's in New England, and so he also, by his own admission, rapes and kills, this time, 2 boys, one in Salem, Massachusetts, and another one in New Haven, Connecticut. During this period, he connects with a 15-year-old boy, not a surprise. This boy's name was George Wallison, and he rapes him, and he forces, essentially, George to join in the crimes that he's committing that include rape and murder. Wallison eventually exposes Panzram after he witnesses the older man murdering another man, and he reports him to the cops in Nyack, New York. And under, again, the alias that we've mentioned before, he is using Captain O'Leary, and he was arrested, finally. Now, Panzram is facing very serious prison time, and he is sent to Sing Sing prison in New York and then to Dannemora, both of which he tried and failed to escape from. Now, for reasons that I don't understand, I don't think any of us can understand, he was released in 1928, and he admits to killing a man in Baltimore soon after that. And then again in Baltimore, he's about a month later after his release, he's arrested for burglary. And this is when he starts to actually confess. It's while he's in custody in this region that he also claims, whether it's true or not, we hope it's not, but we think it probably is, that he claimed 3 other killings in the same year, within months apart of each other, one in Massachusetts, another in Connecticut, and another in Pennsylvania. So now finally, the authorities seem to understand that they have a maniac on their hands, and he is sent to Leavenworth again. This is a place that he would have known and a place that he despised. And he was sentenced to 25 years to life. And upon arrival back at his old home, Panzram tells the sort of intake, the guards, that he says, quote, "I will kill any man that bothers me." And based on his background and his own professions, he's considered too dangerous to associate with other prisoners and was ordered to work alone in the prison laundry. It won't be a surprise to anybody what comes next. Within a year, even less, of his readmittance to Leavenworth, he kills another person. This happened on June 20th of 1929, when he kills a prison guard named Robert Warnke, and he kills him with an iron bar. So Panzram is there, kept alone as this beast, and yet he still finds a way to carry out his barbarity. And for this, now the 25 years to life becomes a death sentence, finally. After he's sentenced to death, he refused all appeals. He actually taunted the sort of nascent anti-capital punishment movement of the time with a famous admonition of them. And he said, quote, "The only thanks you and your kind will ever get from me for your efforts on my behalf is that I wish you all had one neck and that I had my hands on it." What happens here is something unusual, and it's been alluded to earlier in the story, and that is when Panzram, who's facing death and seems to be looking forward to it, he is actually befriended. I don't know if that's the right word, but contact is established with a man who was a prison guard named Henry Lesser. And this is ultimately how we know these stories about Panzram, because Lesser took this humane response to a very unhumane person. And he provided Panzram with writing materials, and he encourages Panzram to write his own story, which is the story we're telling today. Panzram's prison diary is available to the public today. So if you're interested in learning more of what he wrote, how much of it is true, how much of it is not, none of us can really know for sure, of course. Most of it seems to be corroborated. I've actually read this diary, and it's appalling. But the line that most stands out, that is remembered about Carl Panzram, and that is the following. And I will quote him here. "In my lifetime, I have murdered 21 human beings. I have committed thousands of burglaries, robberies, larcenies, arsons, and last but not least, I have committed sodomy on more than 1,000 male human beings. For all these things, I am not the least bit sorry. I have no conscience, so that does not worry me." So he doesn't stay on death row very long. And in fact, it's known as the shortest ever deliberation known in American history regarding his fate. As the sadomasochist that he was, he probably welcomed the death sentence that was handed down to him. Panzram, as we might expect, made no attempt to defend himself. In fact, he rejected attorneys that were sent to him to act on his behalf. As the sadomasochist that he was, it's not a surprise that he probably welcomed what was coming to him next. And what did come to him next was he was hanged on September 5th of 1930 at Leavenworth, where he had been so many years before. When the guards tried to place the black hood on his head, he spat in their face. So one simple last act of defiance, but there's actually one more after that. And supposedly he said to the executioner, "Hurry it up, you Hoosier bastard. I could kill a dozen men while you're screwing around." There's just a very, very minor detail here. I'm not sure why he's calling a guard at Leavenworth, which is in the U.S. state of Kansas, why he's calling him a Hoosier, which happens to be not so far away, but in Indiana. Perhaps there's something, maybe somebody out there knows that I don't know about this, but those were known to be his last words. And he's buried at the prison at Leavenworth. Well, I think it's time maybe to go take a shower and clean myself of Carl Panzram. As always, we want to thank all of our listeners out there, and we hope you'll take a listen to other episodes on the podcast and recommend us to friends and family and post some very helpful 5-star reviews. We also invite you to check out our other podcasts. One is called Lost and Unfound, which covers the formerly famous, the infamous, and the forgotten, and Third Party History, which chronicles alternative political movements in the United States.
This concludes the latest episode of Well Hung History. Run away and cry now, but before you do, make sure to subscribe and leave us a killer review. Find us on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, YouTube, and all the rest. New episodes drop regularly. Tom Payne Productions, all rights reserved and preserved.